Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of Allison's Corner. With me, I have a second time guest. Can you go ahead and introduce yourself to the people, please?
Hello. I am Tia Mitchell. I am the Washington Bureau Chief for the Atlanta Journal Constitution. I think I had a different title when I spoke to you last time. So, yes, but I'm back and it's great to be back.
Yay. And I want to thank you for accepting our offer to come back. When we initially met, we were talking more so about the candidates of the
Mhm.
2024 presidential election of Kamala Harris and Donald Trump. Now that the results of the election are over and we officially have Donald Trump as president for a second time, we had a lot of questions about what's going on. They loved your first interview when you were on, and I was like, man, I really want to see how Donald Trump's second term in office will play out or what has been happening so far. So I'm like, Tia, she knows. So let's get her back on. So I
Yeah.
appreciate you coming.
So I think it's so hilarious. I'm wearing the same sweatshirt. That just shows how much I love FAMU. I'm always wearing my FAMU stuff, but I promise it's a
Hey.
new interview. Um, and a lot has transpired. I know initially when you first reached out, Allison, about having a follow up conversation, I asked for some time to see if I could get my head around what to make of Trump 2.0. And I
Mm-hmm.
said, let's wait for a few weeks after inauguration just to see how things are going. Quite frankly, there's still a lot of uncertainty, even among people like me who do this for a living. So I can only imagine what folks who are, at home trying to make sense of the national news, how confusing and overwhelming this all may seem. Because, again, for journalists like me, it's very confusing and overwhelming.
Yeah. Yeah. And again, we're just trying to make sense of everything at this time in our lives. And a
Mm-hmm.
lot has happened since he's taken office on January 20th. So I have a couple questions here. Are
Mm-hmm.
you ready to go into it and explore
Let's
what Trump
go.
2.0 is? Perfect. Okay. So this first question deals more so with policy and governance. What are the most significant policy shifts we've seen in President Trump's second term compared to his first?
So it's so significant, it's like where to start. So in broad terms, President Trump has started remaking the federal government. And I know that sounds, very, wide ranging to say, but that's really what's happening. He
Yeah.
is remaking the federal government, or at least trying. So the question is, how far does he ultimately go? We don't know that answer yet. But what he's trying to do is number one, downsize the federal workforce by laying off workers, by putting workers on leave, by eliminating positions. So that's one way he's remaking the federal government. The second way he's attempting to remake the federal government is installing political loyalists. We've seen this in some of in the cabinet level appointees, which to an extent that's always been the case, that people have installed, their folks, that their new team. Every president brings in his own team. Um, but Trump has taken it to a new level by installing people that didn't have the types of credentials, background, professional experience that previous folks who had similar jobs had. RFK Jr. being Secretary of Health and Human Services, he's not a medical doctor. He's not someone who has a career in public health. He's not someone who has studied these issues. He's a vaccine skeptic. He's someone who's talked about conspiracy theories when it comes to how we eat and what we eat.
Hmm.
And now he's the Secretary of Health and Human Services. Pete Hegseth is Secretary of Defense. Usually that's a high ranking military official. He's a relatively low ranking military official. He hasn't risen the ranks in the armed forces the ways other secretaries of defense have. So those are just two examples. So that's another thing Trump has tried to do. Also, of course, with the Department of Governmental Efficiency Commission, also known as Doge, with Elon Musk. He is going in and trying to reduce federal spending in ways that include eliminating federal agencies like USAID. He says he wants to close the Department of Education. He and so again, those are underway. He's tried to eliminate widely federal grants and certain federal programs. Again, a lot of this is being challenged in the courts, and we don't know where it'll end up. But these are all things that Trump is trying to do broadly. And then I'll say, so that's number one, and that's broad. Number two, of course, is crackdown on immigration.
Mm-hmm.
And so what Trump has done is there always have been immigration arrests ongoing in numbers that I think most people don't see because it doesn't get a lot of media attention. Well, it's getting more media attention now. But what has changed under President Trump is that the immigration arrests have targeted people that in the past, even when Trump was president the first time, were not targeted by immigration enforcement. For example, people who crossed the border illegally or without documentation, without, immigration paperwork or visas or a green card or what have you, crossed the border illegally, but then claimed asylum. They said, "Hey, I left my home because I don't feel safe. There's political strife, or there's violence, or there's crime, or there's some type of crisis there, and I would like to have asylum in the United States." That creates a process where people in the past have been allowed to come. They're registered. They have monitors where ankle monitors where the government knows where they are at all times. They have check-ins, but it can take years for the asylum process because there's such a backlog. It can be years when someone claims asylum to when their case is actually determined whether that asylum is granted. In the meantime, they're often given work permits so they can legally
Mm-hmm.
work in the U.S. Well, under Trump recently, since his inauguration, he has started to arrest some of those folks. The posture of the Trump administration has been um, that anyone who entered the United States without documentation, even if they later claimed asylum, by entering illegally, they are therefore breaking the law and are eligible for deportation. And so we've seen those types of arrests um, increase. Um, Also, there had been agreements that you don't arrest people at schools and churches. Those should be places that were off limits, that people could feel safe, shouldn't feel afraid to go to church or send their kids to school.
Yeah.
Um, that has also changed under the recent administration, where we've seen arrests at churches, and schools are concerned that they could see arrests there too. Um, we also know that Republicans are trying to increase funding for a border wall. Donald Trump has asked for funding to build up Guantanamo Bay in Cuba so that some of the undocumented immigrants who've been arrested can be shipped to Cuba pending deportation. So I will say immigration, and that's something that, quite frankly, both of these things, reshaping the federal government, crack down on immigration, are both things that Trump campaigned on. And then I'll say, I mean, there's so much, but the final thing before I'll let you get to another question is I'll put it all in one basket, the rollback of diversity, equity, and inclusion. Included in that basket is rollback of protections for transgender people. Um, in fact, Trump has said, he has wanted to implement laws to make it clear that transgender people should not be recognized in ways they had in the past. For example, allowing for gender affirming care, allowing the federal government to pay for gender affirming care if you're in the military, um, allowing transgender children to compete in the sport that aligns with their gender identity versus their gender at birth. Trump has made steps to outlaw that, or make it difficult for places that allow it to continue to also receive federal support. If you're a school, for example, that receives federal grants, but you elect that that you allow transgender athletes to compete with their gender identity, you could no longer be eligible for federal funding. And again, rolling back DEI programs. And I like to say diversity, equity, and inclusion because sometimes the acronym allows people to forget what we're talking about. So we're talking about not just diversity programs, but equity, inclusion, making sure that people who are disabled or who have medical issues still can access government programs, government resources, but also that if they choose to work for the federal government, have the proper accommodations. Those are all being rolled back.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, you pretty much touched on the main points that I've seen played out in the media. And I guess a follow up question I have to that, with the laying off of the federal workforce that has been happening, with the implications of immigration taking place, what do you feel like in the next few months or maybe in the next year will, what are the consequences of those things?
And that some of that is to be determined because again, we don't know how far Trump is going to be able to go. But let's
Hmm.
say the courts ultimately let him fire all the people he wants to fire, close all the agencies he wants to close, um, make the federal government look the way he wants to look. The
Right.
risks are that service could go down. Now, what Trump and his supporters are saying is that, these positions weren't always needed, that government can still run more efficiently, use artificial intelligence, use technology, pay people well, and create maximum efficiency from them, and any that there won't be changes in service level. But we don't know because again, we're
Hmm.
talking about fewer people to do work. And quite frankly, the federal government, we're already facing complaints, about, long wait times at the IRS and, you know, long wait times to get appointments for veterans who want health care through the VA and waiting lists for Medicaid and Medicare. So Trump says there won't be an effect in service level, but that's to be determined. That's the
Hmm.
concern, is that there will literally be fewer people to do the work. Air traffic controllers, we saw, a devastating tragedy in Washington, D.C. when a helicopter hit a passenger jet and nearly 70 people died as a result. And there are concerns that, the air traffic controller industry, which is heavily federally regulated for obvious reasons,
Yeah.
um, they need more people, not less, in that any cuts, not just with air traffic controllers, but in related, services that support operations at airports could again lead to, safety concerns. So that's just another example.
Yeah, no, I definitely agree. I wanted to take another turn into some of Trump's economic strategies that we've seen played out as well. What economic policies has the administration implemented to address the current challenges?
So when it comes to the economy, Trump really campaigned to say on day one, I'm going to improve the economy. Gas is too high, groceries are too high, and I'm going to make sure that that comes down on day one. I'm also going to extend the tax cuts. Um, and it's Republicans are struggling right now with how to carry out Trump's wishes with the current political climate and with their concerns about crashing the economy. So a lot of that is stuff that what you just asked, Republicans in Congress are literally trying to figure it out right now.
Hmm.
So Trump wants to make permanent the tax cuts that were passed during his first term in office. But we know that if you extend tax cuts, that's going to lead to, further reductions in income to the federal government. That's going to increase the national deficit. So there are many Republicans who are concerned about that. But they do want to give Trump what he wants. So how do they do that? They don't know. Um, there are concerns that prices, some of Donald Trump's promises aren't happening right now. Prices aren't coming down. quite frankly, inflation is ticking up. Now, he's just gotten office, roughly a month ago. So it's not necessarily his fault that inflation's going up. But so far, there's no indication that what he's doing will address the cost of goods, will address the cost of things, and address, therefore, inflation. Um, and so there's no evidence of what the Trump administration, and again, Republicans now control both houses of Congress. So what they plan to do about that. This conversation's also happening on March 15th. Government funding runs out. So they've got to figure out not just the extra stuff Trump wants to do, like the tax cuts, like immigration dollars, like boosting national defense spending. That's extra stuff. They
Yeah.
got to figure out how to just fund the government at the current level beyond March 15th. And that's why you see them saying, well, we've laid off all these people, so that's funding that we can now distribute to other places. But all the layoffs in the world will not pay for the tax cuts and the increased spending that Donald Trump wants. And so now they're talking about things like, should we adjust Medicaid, which is health care for poor people, make it harder to get Medicaid, or make it harder by maybe having a work requirement, making the standards harder so fewer people are eligible for Medicaid. Um, Again, there are even Republicans who say, hey, I don't want my constituents saying I made it harder for them to get health care. Um, Republicans have repeatedly said they don't want to touch Medicare, which is health care for older people and disabled
Hmm.
people. But again, Medicare is a huge amount of government spending. There are talks about food stamps. It's technically called SNAP, Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, but we know it as food stamps.
Yeah.
Again, that's helping poor people afford food and groceries. Some Republicans say it's time to make it harder to be eligible for food stamps by, again, maybe there should be a work requirement. Are you working? If you're not working, you shouldn't get food stamps if you're able bodied, which they consider if you're not disabled or sick, or there's a reason why you shouldn't work. If you're just not working because you can't find a job, or you say you're unable to find a job, or you just have decided not to look for work, maybe you shouldn't be eligible for food stamps, some Republicans say. Well, again, there are some Republicans and many Democrats who say that's not the way to do it, because if you're poor, whether you're working or not, you got to eat.
Yeah.
Um, and then Social Security, again, Social Security is a big one because it's a big chunk of federal spending. No one wants to cut Social Security, but there are some Republicans who are saying maybe we need to figure out a way to make it more solvent. Should we raise the age where people are eligible to start reaping the benefits of Social Security? That's very unpopular, but it's something that Republicans are saying, hey, maybe we have to do it if we're going to give Trump what he wants, because we got to find the money somewhere. These are all conversations that are happening right now, far from being settled, and they may take some time to figure out. But in the meantime, again, government funding, just current government operations, runs out March 15th. And if there's not an agreement, and it will require Democrats to be on board, because
Yeah.
in the Senate you have the filibuster. Even though Republicans have the majority, they don't have a filibuster proof majority. So they've got to figure out something that Democrats can support. They've got to do it by March 15th. Time is running out. If there is a government shutdown, it's not just the laid off workers that go home. It's most workers, all non-essential workers would go home. And it would be, it happened during the first Trump administration, but it hasn't happened in several years. And there was at least one government shutdown that lasted several days, and it does really affect the U.S. economy.
Yeah. I guess another question with that is, how are all of these tax reforms and economic challenges going to impact the middle class?
So the question is, the answer depends on what they ultimately do. So
Hmm.
let's again go to, kind of if Trump gets his way, he would like to extend the tax cuts. He would like to fund more immigration enforcement. He would like to fund more national security. And he hasn't said how to do it. He's just said this is what I would like to do.
Mm-hmm.
There are some Republicans who think the way to do it is A, by reducing the size of the federal government, cutting, laying off federal workers, and then cutting Medicaid and food stamps mainly. And so if that happens, A, these federal workers that are being laid off are members of the middle class. Federal jobs are considered good paying jobs, good
Yeah.
careers. But these folks, for the most part, are not rich. They're just regular folks, answering calls at the IRS or social workers at your local Medicaid provider, or their government. They're actually private programs funded with government grants. Researchers at the CDC, um, researchers at the National Institutes of Health, food banks in Namibia uh, that are financed through USAID. Um, and if these people get laid off, that's automatically, middle class families that may see themselves struggling to make ends meet, perhaps, quite frankly, now needing government resources in another way. So that's one risk. The other risk, again, when you're talking about cuts to Medicaid and food stamps, you're literally talking about how people eat and how people get health care. So hospitals will tell you they have to treat people who show up no matter what. So
Yeah.
if they're not covered by Medicaid, now hospitals are providing more care that's what they call uncompensated care, where they're basically treating people without getting any money for the services they provide. So a lot of hospitals say that's just going to tax us. Most hospitals are nonprofits, and they say they don't have the resources to provide that care. So it's going to tax local hospital systems, especially your safety net hospitals. The hospitals where, folks who are poor or live in underprivileged communities, every city knows there's that one or two hospital where all the poor folks go to. That's your safety
Mm-hmm.
net hospital.
Yep.
Um, and again, we're talking about people saying, this is going to make it harder for me to live day to day. This is going to make it harder for me to feed my family. It's going to make it harder for my family to survive. We don't know what that looks like, but that's the risk. Again, but we don't know if that's going to happen because there are plenty of Democrats and even some Republicans who are worried about the effects of cutting these programs that people rely on. Um, they're worried about the optics of extending a tax cut that benefits businesses and richer Americans, and turning around and limiting programs that benefit poor Americans. So much of this is uncertain. We don't know where it's going to end up.
Yeah. Another question that I have, and I wanted to go a different route a little bit. You were talking about U.S. aid, which helps with. If you can just give us a brief synopsis of what USA does, because I just want everybody to be sure.
Yeah. So USAID is a program that was started by President John F. Kennedy. And then what it does is it basically funds programs around the globe. It could be nutrition programs, health programs, HIV um, prevention programs, HIV treatment programs. And it's almost like a way to not only help other nations with their crises, whether it's again with public health or food and nutrition, famine, places in famine, US might pay to help them provide food. Um, so it was seen as a way to help people in other nations. But
Mm-hmm.
also, it was like a diplomatic thing where the US could be seen as someone doing good around the world. And so it was part of the Cold War. The Cold War was all about US and Russia, two world powers duking it out. But instead of there being an actual war with gun battle, they were doing it in kind of, so to speak, shady ways. They were doing it in ways that weren't direct conflict. So part of the Cold War was the US saying, we're going to beat Russia because we're going to make all these other countries like us because we're going to give them nice things. We're going to help them feed their families. And they're going to say, the U.S. did this. So, God, USA, America's good. And
Mm-hmm.
so that was why John F. Kennedy did it, because he said this is a better return on our investment. War costs a lot of money.
Mm-hmm.
Relatively little, less than 1% of the federal budget is U.S. aid. And
Oh
so we're
wow.
not spending a lot of money, but we're doing a lot of good. And as a result, people like us. And they're not worried about Russia. They're saying USA's good.
Yeah.
So over the years, presidents, both parties, Congress, both parties have said this is a program worth continuing to put money into because it pays off in dividends. In a country where U.S. is helpful, now it's less likely that someone can get some insurgent teenagers to rise up against the U.S. troops in the base nearby, because they're like, no, 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 we like the U.S. We're not going to attack American soldiers. You're not going to be
Mm-hmm.
able to turn us against America because they're good with us. And
Yeah.
so there's a lot of concern that, again, without U.S. aid, Russia and China, which China is now a new, adversary, it's a communist regime, that China will now and Russia are going to step in and say, see, the U.S. abandoned you. We're stepping in. Now they're going to get all the goodwill. And now
Mm-hmm.
there's conflict, and Russia and China need folks on their side. They'll get it, and people will now say, well, USA, you abandoned us, so don't think we're going to come to your aid. So that's why USA dismantling the program. And what the Trump administration has said is that ultimately they want to move it under the Department of State. Secretary of State Marco Rubio is the new Secretary of State. They're going to move it under the Department of State, is what they said, in that some of the programs funded by USAID could be restarted. They just don't want it to be a separate little agency. But none of that has been worked out. There's all this uncertainty. There's literally food in warehouses rotting. There are clinical trials that the U.S. was doing in other nations to try to help eradicate diseases and come up with new treatments for diseases. Those trials were ended abruptly, and
Yeah.
people were kind of left hanging that were in the middle of treatment. And there are USAID workers that were told to just, they were out of a job, and if they were U.S. citizens, they needed to just return to the U.S. But remember, they had put down roots. If
Mm-hmm.
you're a aid worker in Namibia and
Mm-hmm.
you've been there for 5 years, and your kids were in school, or again, you have a house, you have a home, you can't just say move back to the U.S. I mean, especially if you're working in a foreign, continents away, that's not
Yeah.
something you just get up and move. Um, so there's so much uncertainty, and the Trump administration hasn't said what programs will be restarted, when, how. So there's still a lot of uncertainty.
Yeah. And with that, I do have a question as it relates to foreign policy. How has the administration's foreign policy strategy evolved this second time around?
Ooh, another question where we're still figuring things out. So the two biggest things, foreign policy wise, that are on President Trump's shoulders are the Israel's war with Hamas in Gaza,
Mm-hmm.
which in the final, like really, I think on his final day or close to his final day, President Joe Biden announced a truce between Israel and Hamas. It included the release of some hostages, but an end to the violence, and it envisioned a rebuilding in Gaza. But
Yeah.
it's on President Trump to a ensure the truce stands and that both sides adhered to the agreements they made as part of the truce. And President Trump's folks were involved in those talks.
Mm-hmm.
So, Biden and Trump both can claim credit to an extent for this truce. But it's on, again, President Trump to see it through. And so that's just always a precarious situation, because there's not a lot of trust between Israel and Hamas. But President Trump has also kind of made things more interesting by saying things like he thinks the U.S. or U.S. Companies, U.S. businesses should invest in rebuilding Gaza. And he's even said things like the Palestinians should be removed from Gaza. And
Mhm.
he kind of envisions this almost like a development, like gentrification of Gaza into this brand new shining Riviera of the Middle East, where new things are built by U.S. companies or perhaps by the U.S. government, and Palestinians are relocated elsewhere. Now, again, we don't know if that's going to come to fruition. There's been a lot of concern about that, mainly because you're literally just coming in and moving people out to, again, gentrify their area in a way that is very problematic. But also, where would the people go?
Yeah.
Also, who would pay for it? Also, again, a lot of Republicans under the MAGA, America First kind of iteration of the party under Trump have been very nationalist. So they're not too keen on spending US dollars to rebuild a foreign country. So what Trump has proposed is way outside of, I think, where a lot of Republicans would like to see Trump go. But they don't necessarily want to defy him or disagree with him publicly. So that's kind of something he put out there that we have no idea if he's serious or how that would look. But that's now part of the conversation about what happens because Gaza is a war torn area right now. There are displaced Palestinians, but there are Palestinians living in Gaza who are surrounded by destruction and devastation. And there does have to be rebuilding there. What will be the U.S. role? That's a question mark. So, separate from the war, Israel war with Hamas in Gaza, there's also Russia's war with Ukraine. Russia invaded Ukraine, has taken certain Ukrainian territories in parts of Ukraine and said, this is now not Ukraine, it's part of Russia. Literally just went into their country and said, now you're with us.
Yeah.
And that battle has been ongoing for years. Trump has said he's going to end that war. Um, Marco Rubio is in Saudi Arabia, right as we record,
Hmm.
meeting, trying to bring everyone together. And again, other nations are involved in the talks, but how do they bring to a close Russia's war in the Ukraine, and what can be done so it doesn't look like Russia got everything? Because that would look like capitulation to Russia, which basically again just walked into a country and took parts of the country for itself. But Trump again, there have been comments from members of the Trump administration that have been considered not helpful to these conversations. For example, Pete Hegseth said, well, we should take off the table Ukraine joining NATO. Well, that's something that NATO is an alliance that Ukraine has asked for to say, I need to join y'all because I need y'all to
Yeah.
help me because Russia keeps trying to take our country.
Yeah.
So to take that off the table takes away something that Ukraine has already been asking for. So it's like, well, you already, even before we get to the table to negotiate, you saying I can't get something I've been asking for. So
Hmm.
there's concern that these negotiations are going to be too friendly to Russia. We know that Putin, Russian President Vladimir Putin, and U.S. President Donald Trump speak highly of each other. Trump has said Putin is a friend. There's always been that concern that Trump is going to be too friendly to Russia. We'll see how those talks unfold. Again, everyone agrees there should be an end to the conflict. There is a concern that the U.S. is going to negotiate an end that is too friendly to Russia and screws over Ukraine. Those talks are starting. Even in Europe, European leaders are so worried about it. They're having an emergency meeting as well, just among themselves to say, listen, we don't trust what the U.S. is doing. Let's go ahead and get ourselves together. So these things are still ongoing. This conflict has been going on for years. There
Yeah.
has been a lot of U.S. money sent to Ukraine to help Ukraine defend itself. there are a lot of Republicans, again, America First nationalist Republicans say, I'm tired of sending money to Ukraine. We need to spend money on U.S. soil. Ukraine needs to figure it out for themselves or let Europe handle it. Let go to your European allies. Quit coming to the U.S. and asking the U.S. to send you money. So there's not a lot of energy among Republicans in Congress to continue to send money to help Ukraine defend itself. But I think there still are Republicans and a lot of Democrats who believe that coming across as soft towards Russia ultimately weakens the US beyond just Ukraine. Because again, Russia is that superpower, that dictatorship, that authoritarian regime that many U.S. elected officials in Congress and historically our presidents have said is, the antithesis of American democracy, and
Yeah.
for generations America has, quite frankly, our foreign policy has been focused on promoting democracy and trying to weaken authoritarian states. So under Trump, maybe that's not as much of a priority. We will see.
Yeah. And my last question for you is, how has this administration's relationship with the media changed the second time around?
Um, I wouldn't say it changed because Trump was kind of always attacking the media even during his first term, and those attacks have ramped up again.
Yeah.
But there definitely is a contrast coming from the Biden administration. Now, some of it's good. Donald Trump talks to the media all the time. He has a signing of executive actions. He signs those papers and then he's answering questions from the media. He's walking to the back of Air Force One and he's talking to the media while he's flying to different stops. He's out and about having a public appearance or having a meeting with foreign heads of states. He's going to have a time to answer questions from the media. That did not happen with President Biden. President Biden, literally, you could count probably on one hand the amount of press conferences he's done. Um, Donald Trump, you could probably need your hands and your toes to count the number of press conferences he's done in a month. So there's definitely a contrast toward as far as accessibility. Donald Trump is way more accessible to the media. However, Donald Trump has been way more combative with the media in other ways. He's attempted to restrict Associated Press access to White House events because the Associated Press is not unilaterally using Gulf of America instead of Gulf of Mexico. That's an infringement of free speech. Donald Trump has tried to install more um, conservative media at White House briefings, which is fine. The media is the media and access is access. Free speech is free speech. But I think there is a perception that Donald Trump is trying to sideline legacy media, traditional media, media that he considers less friendly, media that's more objective. And that, again, is a concern about the First Amendment and access for folks who are just trying to tell the story. The Associated Press does not have an agenda. People like me, I don't have agenda. I just want to tell the truth and tell the story. But if you limit access in certain ways, you limit our ability to tell the story. And that's very concerning coming from the Trump administration.
Yeah. There's always going to be three sides to the truth: yours, mine, and somewhere in the middle. So, for sure. Well, Tia, I want to thank you for coming back on today. I feel like you gave us so much information, as always, about what is currently happening in Trump's second term in office. Definitely filled me in on some things that I wasn't even aware of. Before you go, if you can, just let the people remind them where we can find you, girl.
Yes, I'm Tia Mitchell. I'm on Twitter, if you're still on Twitter, at AJC on Washington. I'm on Blue Sky. You can look me up, Tia Mitchell. I'm on Facebook, facebook.com/Tia Reports. And I also have my own podcast called Politically Georgia.
Yes, I love it. I love it. We have to check it out. And for everyone else listening, of course, God bless. Have an amazing day, and thank you for listening to Allison's Corner.